session will be recorded. No confidential information shall be shared in this cafe session. In this cafe, the speakers express their personal view and opinions. This is not necessarily the official AI for Media project opinion. And the cafe, what is it about? It's an online forum to gain insight into the European AI scene. Participants get the chance to share knowledge and experiences and meet stakeholders from various areas of AI research and application. So welcome everybody who's joining us today, all the participants coming in. Great you're here today. I'm very, very happy. And please interact with us, send us questions. We need your questions. We will read it to Donatella, to the speaker after her presentations. So if you have any other questions, also send it, please, then I can answer it, or Teresa. And now to the highlight. Donatella Casaburo is a legal researcher at the Karl Löwen Center for IT and IP Law. She is the main contact for H2020 project Aligner. It's artificial intelligence roadmap for policing and law enforcement, and part of the team working on the cybersecurity project EnsureSec. Donatella holds a cum laude master's degree in law from the University of Trieste, where she wrote her thesis on the relationship between the UN and the EU counter-terrorism measures and the right to privacy. She's currently finalizing an advanced LLM in IT law at Karl Löwen with a thesis in the field of privacy engineering. Prior to joining CITIP, Donatella worked as an advocacy officer and policy analyst for a law firm specialized in government affairs. So this is really impressive, and I'm very happy you are there, Donatella. So thank you, and I will now hand over the moderator role to you, so you can start introducing yourself and your presentation. And I'm very, very happy again that you all are joining, all the participants. It's really a pleasure to have you here each week. So please always come back and send us your questions. So now it's your floor.
Thank you for introducing me. Well, as already introduced by Carmen, I'm Donatella Casaburo, and I'm actually a legal researcher at KU Leuven. So I work in the Department of IT and IP Law, CITIP, and I am specialized in data protection and cybersecurity and cybercrime, especially in the field of law enforcement. As Carmen already said, I am actually working right now on Aligner, which is an H2020 funded project on artificial intelligence and use of artificial intelligence tools in law enforcement agencies. And my presentation today is actually funded by Aligner itself. I will now start sharing my screen. I guess you see it already.
Yes, yes, we see it. Great.
And
yes.
You see my presentation. Okay, so as I was saying, this presentation is funded by Aligner and is part of Work Package for Ethics and Law. So let's give a brief overview of what I will speak about in the next 30 minutes. So I will introduce briefly how AI tools can be used in law enforcement, and then I will delve into the concept of predictive policing. I will analyze the European applicable legal framework and then some selected legal and ethical concerns, and then I will end up with this with some case studies. So how AI tools can be used in law enforcement. I have adopted this division that's proposed in a report that was prepared by Professor Fuster for the European Parliament, in which she identified 4 different main current trends of the use of AI tools in law enforcement. First, we have the predictive policing. I will delve into that more in the next slides. Then AI tools can be used for facial recognition in criminal justice and in border controls. Starting with facial recognition, what we mean by AI and facial recognition. This is the automatic identification or authentication of an individual by matching these facial features for two or more digital images. The most controversial application of facial recognition is live or real-time facial recognition that I'm pretty sure you have heard a lot before about. Here are a few examples of how these AI tools can be actually used. For instance, cameras at railway stations or airports, or surveillance systems to monitor also the attendance of students in high school, live cameras at the entrance of stadiums to identify people that have been banned from attending football matches. A second application of AI in law enforcement can be that of criminal justice. This aims at improving the accountability and predictability of the judicial decisions, and meanwhile reducing the discretionary powers in the hands of the judges. A few examples again, for instance, chatbots that are facilitating the access to law, or instruments for online or alternative disputes resolutions, or also predictive tools to calculate risk of misconduct in case of probation or risk of recidivism of already convicted subjects. Last, AI in border controls. This is actually one of the first applications within the European Union of AI tools. We have a lot of databases, border related, within the European Union, and there's a huge data flow between these information systems and law enforcement agencies. For instance, these AI tools can be used for classifying individuals, for generating scores, probability assessment, or other indicators that are supporting the human decision making. They can be used to flag cases for further review or investigation, or they can also be used for providing recommendations on application or for making full decisions. Delving more into the core of the presentation, I will from now on speak about predictive policing, again, one of the applications of AI tools within the field of law enforcement. So what is first predictive policing? This is the first definition that has been proposed that says that predictive policing is any policing strategy or tactic that develops and uses information and advanced analysis to inform forward-thinking crime prevention. This consists of 5 different elements: integrating information and operation, seeing the big picture, using cutting-edge analysis and technology, linking to performance of an organization, and adapting to changing positions. As you might realize by yourself, this definition is quite broad. So more and more definitions have been proposed. And in my study, I have adopted this more operative definition that says that predictive policing is the collection and analysis of data about previous crimes for the identification and the statistical prediction of individual or geospatial areas with an increased probability of criminal activity to help developing police intervention and prevention strategies and tactics. So here we have 2 main key features: the usage of a broad variety of data and the connection with preemptive policing. So we use a broad variety of data with the aim to expose and understand crime trends by using this data that could be structured or unstructured. And preemptive policing, because law enforcement agencies can act before criminal activities actually take place to prevent crime from happening. What are the potential benefits of predictive policing? First of all, it helps law enforcement agencies in decision making. They can also deploy their resources more efficiently and effectively because they can be deployed actually more accurately in place and time in respect of identified areas with increased risk. There could be a preemptive identification of individuals that could potentially be involved in acts of crimes, either as victim or as offender themselves. So this is an example of profiling of individuals. These are a few examples of predictive policing tools that are actually right now used by the police within the European Union. For instance, iPolice, that's used in Belgium. They have centralized all this police data on a cloud to identify times and spots where there is a heightened chance of criminal activity. Then the German police is using a lot of different algorithms for calculating where burglaries are more likely to occur. Key crime is instead used in Italy. It analyzes automatically the behavior of criminals, suspects, and witnesses to identify trends and rationalize the use of police force. And then there's ProKid 12-SI that I will bring later on as a case study. What is the applicable European legal framework? We have a few instruments that can be actually applied. I will speak mostly about Law Enforcement Directive and the AI regulation proposal, even though it's still a proposal not adopted. But also, first, there are also other instruments, as for instance, the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, the European Convention on Human Rights, Convention 108, on the protection of individuals with regards of automatic processing of personal data that are, of course, relevant here. Let's start with the data protection framework. First of all, why the EU data protection framework applies in the case of predictive policing. Usually, predictive policing tools entail the collection and processing of data. In general, the EU data protection framework is applicable whenever data that are processed are relayed for the means of content, purpose of effect to an identified or identifiable natural person. Of course, the concept of identifiability takes into account all the means reasonably to be used to single out an individual. So we have to conclude that the EU data protection framework is generally applicable to the processing of personal data for predictive policing purposes, of course, because the aim is to identify, single out individuals or anyway areas that can have a heightened chance of crime. So these are data that are related by the means of content, purpose of effect to identified or identifiable natural persons. Even though an evaluation on a case-by-case basis is still needed. In this case of predictive policing, we apply the Law Enforcement Directive, which is the equivalent of the GDPR in the field of the law enforcement. This is why the Law Enforcement Directive regulates the processing of personal data by competent authorities for the purposes of prevention, investigation, detection, or prosecution of criminal offences, or the execution of criminal penalties. Who are the competent authorities? Public authorities that are competent for the prevention, investigation, detection, or prosecution of criminal offences, or bodies or entities that are entrusted by the member state law to exercise this public authority and these public powers for the purposes that I've already mentioned. So in this case, we apply the Law Enforcement Directive, while LEAs are processing data through the means of predictive policing tools. What are the relevant provisions of the Law Enforcement Directive? The general principles related to the processing of the personal data that are listed in Article 4, for instance, the principles of lawfulness and fairness, the principle of purpose limitation, the data minimization, the principle of accuracy and quality, and the principle of security. Those are fairly similar to the ones that have that are already listed in the GDPR. Very much important also in the context of predictive policing is the concept of data protection by design and by default. That demands that appropriate technical and organizational measures are already implemented in the design and development stage of the technology, so to integrate safeguards and comply with the legal requirements and protects rights of natural people involved. Also very important in this case is the need to conduct a data protection impact assessment whenever the processing is likely to result in a high risk to rights and freedoms of natural persons. This has to be evaluated by taking into account the scope, nature, and the context of the purpose, and data protection impact assessment is demanded, especially in case of new technologies. This has to be conducted prior to the processing in order to evaluate the risk, the freedom, and the risk to the rights and freedoms of the individuals, and in order to implement preemptively mitigation and compliance measures. Also, with the need to conduct a data protection impact assessment, there's also the need to consult with the supervisory authority of the country. Another provision which is really relevant under the Law Enforcement Directive is the provision that regulates the automated individual decision making and including profiling, which is Article 11. Article 11 says that decisions that are based solely on automated processing, including profiling, that are producing adverse legal effects or anyway significantly affecting data subjects are prohibited unless they are authorized by law and appropriate safeguards are implemented. These appropriate safeguards can be, for instance, human intervention, the right to explanation, and the possibility to challenge the decision made by the algorithm. The profiling is that based on sensitive categories of data is prohibited, but it's prohibited unless suitable measures to safeguard data subjects' rights and freedoms are in place. What is absolutely prohibited is that the automated decision making that involves discrimination. As for the AI regulation proposal, again, this is a proposal, so it has to be discussed. It will be adopted more or less in a couple of years. So this is based on the draft published by the Commission. The Commission adopted a nuanced risk-based approach. The Commission divided different AI applications on a base of the risk they entail, so an acceptable risk and then prohibited AI practice, high-risk AI systems, for instance, AI systems that are intended to be used as safety component of products, or that are subject to a third-party ex-ante conformity assessment, or other AI systems with which have mainly fundamental rights implications that are listed in Annex number 3. For instance, one of them is the AI used in law enforcement, and then low or minimal risk AI systems. What happens when AI systems are entailing unacceptable risks? These practices are prohibited, which are those who are contravening the union values, or where practices that are likely to manipulate persons or to exploit vulnerabilities anyway, AI-based social scoring, and more relevant in this in the field of predictive policing is the use of real-time remote biometric identification systems in public accessible places for the purposes of law enforcement. A small disclaimer, rather small disclaimer here is that we have 3 exceptions that are anyway subject to prior authorization to this prohibition, general prohibition. So it is allowed to use real-time remote biometric identification systems in the case of targeted search for specific potential victims of crime, for the prevention of specific substantial and imminent threats to the life or physical safety of natural persons, or in the case of terrorist attack, or in the case of detection, localization, identification, or prosecution of a perpetrator or a suspect of a criminal offense. So we have to conclude that in general there's this prohibition, but these 3 exceptions are so broad that we can't really talk about prohibition anymore. When AI systems are categorized as high risk, we have stricter requirements that have to be implemented. For instance, risk management systems, data and data governance provisions, technical documentations and record keeping, transparency provisions, and also provisions that are allowing users to have more information. The need to have human oversight, robustness of the AI system, and accuracy and security. What are the legal and ethical concerns instead associated to predictive policing tools? So I'll start with the legal concerns. As for privacy and data protection, well, first of all, there might be an unjustifiable interferences in private life and personal data. There's also a dubious compliance of these tools with the European applicable legal framework. This for two main reasons. There's a lack of specific legal basis, and also there's in most of the cases insufficient safeguards for individuals are provided. Also, the effectiveness of these tools is in some cases unproven, and the effects on rights and freedoms are disproportionate. So there are blurred boundaries for the use of predictive policing tools. Also, there are concerns associated to the right of having a fair trial, and so the right to due process. This is why big data and algorithms are identifying threats and possible suspects, and this might violate the principle of presumption of innocence. So we have witnessed this shift from the presumption of innocence towards a presumption of guiltiness until proven innocent. Also, the principle of equality of arms might be violated because suspects would have limited access to the reasoning behind the case and the evidence collected during the investigation. And this is related to the problem of the opacity of the algorithms that I will mention in a second. And to conclude, the overall fairness of the trial is endangered due to the lack of respect for other fundamental rights, such as privacy, non-discrimination, and access to information. Other legal concerns are related to the freedom of speech and freedom of association, because this surveillance and excessive monitoring of, for instance, telecommunication, or anyway, this collection of big data has chilling effects on the freedom to hold and share opinions. And these analytical systems can also impede the exercise of these rights. Finally, concerns related to non-discrimination and equal treatment, because big data analytics and algorithms or automated processing may cause the risk of exacerbating divides and continuing biased strategies and difficulties to challenge the decisions taken. And also the use of discriminatory algorithms can then lead to an unfair treatment of people on the basis of protected attributes. As for ethical concerns, we have concerns related to the data selection and then consequently machine bias, because data could be insufficient, irrelevant, inaccurate, outdated, or anyway of poor quality, and this might lead to inaccurate predictions. And also the use of historical data might fortify existing bias. The opacity that I was mentioning before, this is the concept of the black box of the algorithms. There's a lack of transparency within machine learning and AI tools in general, because they are inscrutable also by those who are affected or involved in them, but they might also be inscrutable by those who have actually programmed them. And this can hide the shortcomings of the technology and prevents the understanding, causing this loss of trust of the citizens towards the state. We have problems of accountability. So who is accountable in case the decisions are made by algorithms? So there's this inability to assign the responsibility or to provide anyway a satisfactory justification. And lastly, there's the risk of focusing too much on the individual while overlooking the effects of the policing on a wider group of people. Here we conclude my presentation with two case studies. Small disclaimer here, both case studies have been taken by AI tools that have been deployed by the Dutch police, not because we are targeting the Dutch police for any reason, but because the Dutch police and anyway Dutch government is one of the most clear and transparent on the predictive policing tools actually used by the police, by the law enforcement agencies. So there's a lot of literature that can be studied there, and then like all their reports and deliverables are anyway public. So this is why we have taken like these two cases from the Dutch police. So the first one is Siri. That's an algorithm that's assessing the likelihood of tax fraud, fraud with social benefits, and fraud with labor legislation. The input data are financial data of citizens, data on social benefits, history of citizens, data on education, or data about integrating within Dutch society. And the output is the assessment of the risk level of the individual for one or more of the three types of fraud that I mentioned before. What is the clear benefit of this algorithm? The citizens who are likely to commit fraud crimes can be further investigated. Actually, further administrative and criminal investigation can be conducted by the police, law enforcement officers, supervisory authorities, municipalities, and other relevant authorities after they have citizens have been flagged by the algorithm. What are the legal and ethical concerns instead? Lack of transparency, because the risk model used for the assessment is secret, and individuals are not even warned if they have been identified as high risk, and then if further investigation are conducted towards them. There's a risk of discrimination and stigmatization, because the algorithm is used primarily in low-income neighborhoods that are already deemed as high risk. There's also risk of mass surveillance, because the data sources are so numerous and varied that virtually no individual that is residing in the Netherlands would be exempted from these data processing. So here there's an interesting court case because Siri has been scrutinized by the District Court of The Hague on the basis of the European Convention on Human Rights, and has been held in violation of the convention for three main reasons. First of all, this is a disproportionate invasion in the private life of the citizens. It is not transparent and not verifiable enough, and there's a risk of discrimination, stigmatization based on socioeconomic status and possible migration background. The last case study is instead ProKid 12-SI, again implemented by the Dutch police. This is a risk assessment algorithm that is used for assessing the risk of criminality of 12-year-old children. What are the input data? Existing police data on these children, such as reports, whatever case children have come into contact with the police. The address of these children, the information about the living environment, and whether they have been victim of violence. What is instead the output? The evaluation of the child, first of all, and then the assessment of the home address against 4 color-coded risk categories, which is demonstrating an increasing degree of risk. So this evaluation involves risk qualification and the eventual bad influence of the family members or other people that are living in the same address with the child. What are the benefits? Well, according to the Dutch police, this would help prevention of problems that children might suffer in their closest social environment, and also prevention of problems that children can cause to others with an antisocial or delinquent behavior. So this is deployed for saving children from potential further harm. What are instead the legal and ethical concerns? So first of all, this risk assessment is highly dependent on the children's social environment and is disregarding individual factors related to the child himself. There's a lack of balance between the risk and the protecting factors because there's no distinction between victims, witnesses, or perpetrators while a color code is assigned. So there's a consequent erosion of the presumption of innocence and a violation of Article 6 of the Law Enforcement Directive, which mandates a clear distinction between the personal data of suspects, convicted victims of a criminal offense, and other parties such as witnesses. And lastly, this, of course, the output of this algorithm is the profiling of the children that might lead to possible stigmatization or also biased behavior of the law enforcement agencies professionals while interacting with the assessed child. So this is a violation of Article 11 of the Law Enforcement Directive that I explained before on automated individual decision making. It's a violation of the right to non-discrimination and also a violation of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. So these are more sources in case you're interested in predictive policing, and the sources I used for preparing this presentation. I will thank you right now, like you all for your attention, and I'm here to answer to all of your questions. Just a small addition here. As I mentioned before, this presentation has been funded by Aligner, which is an H2020 project, so funded by the European Commission. Aligner is a project that deals with AI tools and law enforcement agencies. So our aim is to develop a roadmap, so some guidelines that law enforcement agencies can actually use while deploying their AI tools. And we are building this stakeholders group. We have a very big scientific advisory board. So if you're interested and you want to actually take part to this to our activities, you can connect to the website. So it's aligner-h2020.eu, and you can request to be part of our scientific advisory board. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Donatella. Super interesting. It's basically you get an insight into all the legal complications and ethical complications which may arise if you do AI services and applications. And that comes to my question. Can you give an example of an existing legal and ethical trustworthy artificial intelligence application in your eyes?
Actually, I have a really good example about this. Again, taken by the Dutch police. So, for instance, they were, I don't know if it's right now still used or not, but anyway, they had this risk assessment algorithm for evaluating violent behavior. And the input data were police reports, so unstructured data, and also structured data. So, for instance, incident, the codes of the incidents committed. Those were labeled against specific labels, and they were used for then evaluating the likelihood of a person to express violent behavior afterwards. It's necessary here to clarify that these labels were finite number, so they were not using machine learning algorithms to expand these labels. And labels were, for instance, confused, crisis, psychotic, alcohol, drug, and so on. And those had a different weight. So while deploying this algorithm, they were actually taking into consideration the guidelines on trustworthy AI that were published at the time by the high-level expert group on AI. And for instance, for human autonomy, they were always having a human in the loop that was making the final assessment of the decision taken by the algorithm. For the principle of prevention of harm, there were protocols that were implemented for preventing the bias, and also they were dividing the police who were actually in the streets doing the checks of the population, and the police who was actually interpreting the decision of the algorithm. For fairness, for the principle of fairness, there was a deep understanding of the data used and the context in which the algorithm was deployed, and there was also the possibility of giving feedbacks about possible bias. And as for explicability, again, there was this limited list of labels, so that the outcome of the decision could have been then explained on the basis of the labels that were actually used by the algorithm. So this is just one of the examples of how you can actually implement the already existing guidelines in algorithms, AI applications within the field of law enforcement.
Yes, Great example, because it's important. I think it's the key is this explainability, that a human can explain the
Yes,
system,
indeed.
the data. It's pre-thought by design. Huh? It's like really with the people, the police designed, so they understand. So great example, I must say. And Teresa, you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question. Is the use of AI in the context of crime prevention automatically linked to complete surveillance of the population?
Well, automatic linked, it's a strong word. So there's a risk. We have seen, for instance, in the case study I was mentioning before about the Syria, that the District Court of The Hague basically concluded there was no possibility that Dutch citizens were not listed and not and the data of the citizens were not actually processed by the algorithms because the data protected were too broad. So there's a risk, but actually it depends on how the algorithm is used and what are the data sources. So here, well, there's also a lot of case law about mass surveillance, both from the Court of Justice of the European, but also from the European Court of Human Rights. And what is always emphasized by the court is the need to conduct a proportionality test. So is the algorithm really necessary for achieving the purpose, or do we have less invasive instruments that can actually be used by the police? Is it proportionate to the purpose? This has to be evaluated. On the other side, we have to evaluate whether there are sufficient safeguards for the citizens, whether these algorithms are explainable, whether they are verifiable, whether they are transparent, whether they are foreseeable, like the application of the algorithm in itself is foreseeable, whether there's a court review. So to make it short, yes, there's a risk of mass surveillance, but it actually depends on how these algorithms are actually used by the police. If sufficient safeguards are provided for citizens, if they are proportionate and necessary, then there shouldn't be mass surveillance.
Thank you.
Thank you. I will now read a question from Agnes, where it basically starts, it's in 3. Was any human oversight in these cases you mentioned before, in this use cases you had? Were this program used instead of human decision mankind, or have these programs just helped the decision making?
Well, it depends actually on the algorithm. For instance, in Siri, the algorithm was flagging out the individuals, and once they were flagged out, then automatically there were investigations. So if you consider the follow-up investigations as human oversight, yes, there was human oversight, but there was no human oversight in the first place. So after flagging the individual, do we actually need a further investigation or not? Is it like a false positive or not? So it depends in which stage you want to implement the human oversight here. In case of ProKit 12-SI, well, yeah, there is actually human oversight, even though it's not entirely clear how the algorithm works. It's not entirely clear who's flagged out. So before any action is taken, there is human oversight, but there's no possibility of intervening before an action is taken. For instance, the parents of the kids who are scrutinized by algorithm were actually complaining about the fact that they didn't know that the kids were on the algorithm.
Yes, yes. So it's there's basically there are black holes of understanding, if I can say it naively. It's hardly understood, and that's of course the danger. No? That's why this ethical design from the beginning, it should really be designed so you can explain it to other human beings. No? And here comes the question of Denitza. are there existing approaches as to how to designing ethical predictive policing tools?
Also, well, actually, there are a lot of guidelines out there, but yeah, if you want to join a liner in the scientific advisory board, you can provide us your insights. But aside from jokes, there are a lot of guidelines. There's a lot of research that has been doing right now about it. But there's not a single instrument that you can actually implement. Because it's highly dependent on a case-by-case basis. So it depends on the algorithm in itself, and also it's everything really under development right now. It's not a new field, but the attention to the ethics and the legal aspects of this is fairly new, let's say. So there's a lot of research that's still ongoing right now.
Yes. When the audience has questions, how to get to a liner, is there a website?
Yes, there's a website. It's at the end of my presentation that then will be shared with you. You can apply for being part of, well, if you are a representative of law enforcement agency, we also have a board for law enforcement agencies. Otherwise, there is a specific scientific advisory board, and we are welcome people from academia, from the industry, for instance, or anyway, whoever is interested and has an expertise on that can help us in fulfilling our goals.
Okay. Yes, so we hear already who wants to have the presentation. I will get the presentation from Donatella, and please send me an email. It's in the invitation, it's in the registration. You find my email everywhere. You even get a reminder. So just send me a request and you will get everything, the information. So Ben asks, hello, don't you think that we fall into very strict rule-based regulations rather than principle-based regulations? Using AI intensively may lead, as you mentioned, to the violation of presumption of innocence. At the end of the day, we have still humans who introduce data to algorithms. Data can be biased from the beginning. The use of machine learning neural networks can help to predict, but you may also refer to it goes on. You may also refer to KYC customer due diligence that should be followed by financial institutions, the FATF formed by the G7. So the question was before, don't you think that we fall into very strict rule-based regulations rather than principle-based regulations?
Well, this is actually one of the problems while regulating technology in itself. It's aside from AI, it's a general problem. Like, how do we regulate technology? Do we regulate technology by imposing strict rules, or do we regulate technology by imposing instead more guidelines and general principles? Pros and cons about both approaches. What we have to keep in mind is that we have to regulate this phenomenon. We want a type of regulation that's future-proof, because we don't, well, typically legislation is already lagging behind technology in itself, and we don't want another piece of regulation that will be outdated in 2-3 years. That's actually a pretty big risk. And also, we don't want to hamper the use of AI in general, or technology in general. We want to foster the development of the technology, because we don't want to lag behind as a society. So how do you want to regulate this? In general, principles and guidelines are those who are more future-proof, because they can be adapted, they are a bit broader instead of specific regulation, but they can not be sufficient. For instance, if we have different policy documents on AI and guidelines on trustworthy AI, ethical AI, and so on, and the Commission still needed actually a regulation for regulating the AI application, this is a really good sign of the fact that guidelines in themselves are not sufficient because they are not enforceable. On the other hand, if you see the AI proposal, this doesn't really provide for super specific and strict rules, but everything is quite broad and open to interpretation, and again, future-proof for this reason. So again, this is my personal point of view. Personally, I would say, yeah, we should implement more broader regulations, so not strict rules, but still rules, not only guidelines that are not sufficient, not enforceable, and not followed then.
Okay, thank you. Very good answer, I must say. And yeah, I have asked from the audience, and then maybe Teresa, we're coming to the end slowly. What are the most important, it's from Tim, what are the most important blind spots in current EU regulation to address ethical issues in predictive policing in your eyes?
Well, first of all, we still don't have the AI regulation. The AI regulation has a lot of problems in terms of predictive policing tools. For instance, as I was mentioning before, the theoretical prohibition of deploying live cameras, live biometric identification systems, and so on, which is actually not really prohibited since the exceptions are so broad. So that's, for instance, one. On the other hand, we can also say that we have a pretty good basis from where to start. That's the Law Enforcement Directive, which is providing a lot of safeguards and also rights for data subjects, which is something that's actually not done in the AI regulation proposal. So even though that piece of legislation will for sure be important, the actual rights for the data subjects are given by the Law Enforcement Directive. The only problem of this is it's a directive, so it has to be implemented, and it's implemented differently depending on the country. So this is actually really, then it becomes a national discussion, not entirely a European discussion. It depends on how the Law Enforcement Directive is implemented within the country, and then you can identify the shortcomings of that.
Okay, and I get another one because Ben is active.
No problem.
But we promise that we are not going overtime. I have another question from Ben. What about RegTech automation of compliance itself?
I have to say that I don't know RegTech, so I can't answer. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Teresa,
but
I would be very much interested in that. So please, if you want to send me something, my email is at the end of the presentation. So please feel free. We can discuss about this a bit later on.
Exactly. So, but now we are closing in. Teresa, would you like to have a last question?
Yeah, it's my pleasure. One of my questions is, if the state uses this data from the AI, how does it ensure that it does not fall into the wrong hands? And with it, I mean the state.
So, well, this is the problem of hacking, of course. Again, it's a risk. It's a risk that law enforcement agencies are facing every day. It's an even more so risk if law enforcement agencies are outsourcing some of their tasks. Like, for instance, it was really famous the case of Clearview AI, in which law enforcement agencies were relying on external providers for databases. And they were using data coming from the private sector. So this is a risk. Well, the risk can be addressed, has to be addressed. The first solution that comes to my mind is cybersecurity. Cybersecurity measures should be stronger than the ones actually right now deployed, both from a technical perspective. So technical cybersecurity, like informatic cybersecurity measures, but also from an awareness perspective, protocols for people who are actually accessing the data, limiting, for instance, the access to only a few selected people, or people who have been specifically trained on cybersecurity and how to manage this data. And also, cybersecurity should be more supported by the governments, because not all the police offices are the same. Not all of them can actually implement the same cybersecurity measures. So if the government is not increasing the funds for implementing cybersecurity measures within law enforcement agencies, well, then there's not that much that police officers themselves can do. And this turns out to be also a threat to national security. So this is why also more prominent intervention from the government would be really much needed here.
Okay, thank you. So I think we are coming to the end. And so we heard that you will send me the presentation. So anybody who wants to have the presentation, please send me an email. And also the recording, as always, will be shared with the speaker, in this case, Donatella, and she decides if she wants to publish it or not. She gives me green light or not, then also this will be available on the AI Cafe video archive, if you call it like this. So I wish you a very nice afternoon. Thank you very much, Donatella. Thank you, Teresa. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for everybody out there and all the participants. It's a pleasure that you come to the cafe, and have a nice afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for inviting me. Bye-bye.
Yes. Bye-bye. It was a pleasure.